nudist and actually one of our founding fathers. Ray, can you tell us how long have you been a nudist?
Well, you remember too, in '89, we had a special presentation at the convention in Michigan where they were celebrating our 50th year
Yes, I
in
was there.
nudism. And we helped to start the Van Tans in 1939, and that was the oldest club in Canada, and still is. So that was our first claim to fame, was that we merely helped. We were one of the charter members. Then I went away overseas, and when I came back, they eventually elected me secretary of the Van Tans, and I was reading, had been reading all of the American Sunshine and Health magazines and Donald Johnson's writings about how a club could prosper with PR. I quoted these as gospel to the Van Tans, but they would have no part of a sign, for instance, on their gate. That was
Okay.
a no-no in those days. So eventually, after being secretary of the Van Tans for 3 years and founding the Canadian Sunbathing Association, I wonder if you even have heard of that.
I'm aware of the Canadian Sunbathing Association. I didn't know that you were one of the founders, but I'm not surprised.
Well, I was the actual initiator of the Canadian Sunbathing Association, and I had already helped here in the Northwest to write the Constitution of the NSA. And so, with that for a guideline, and the CSA, which is no longer in existence around Ohio and Indiana and so forth, but they were just starting up then, and their constitution was worth copying. So between the two, I wrote up a constitution for Canadian nudists, and in October of 1946, we had a meeting, believe it or not in a club, but in the Moose Hall in the heart of Vancouver, the pouring rain, and we ironed out that constitution of the Canadian Sunbathing Association, and they elected me national secretary, which I served in that capacity for 3 years. Now that was 1946, and I carried on as secretary of the Canadian Sunbathing Association until an Eastern man, Carl Rule, was elected, and about that time, I had got talking to a man. I was a postal clerk, and I was on the wickets. And this man would come in on Friday night loaded down with parcels, and we would get talking about what we were going to do on the weekend. And I didn't tell him what I was going to do, but he told me that he was busy making a park on the back half of his 40 acres of land in Surrey. Well, every time you stood on the bluff at the Van Tans and the clouds were hanging over the sun, you'd look across the valley and see in Surrey the beautiful sunshine. So I told this gentleman that I thought I knew some people that might join him in such an endeavor, that it would just be a pleasant weekend for them. But first he invited me down to see the land, and we walked over what has just ceased to be the Sunny Trails Club. And before I left there, why, we had made a deal to lease that land, the 20 acres, the back 20 that he was working on, would be leased to a group of nudists for only the taxes on his whole 40. He wouldn't set a price and he wouldn't sell, but he did agree to sign a lease, which was properly recorded, and gave us first option to buy.
Mhm.
So that was how we started the Sunny Trails Club. And that took place in 1952. And I was the managing director of the Sunny Trails Club for the first 5 years. And then I got the trailer bug. And there was no place in Canada in 1958 to go with a trailer beyond Winnipeg. You couldn't go east beyond Winnipeg. So my wife and I agreed that if the U.S. government would give us a visa, I would resign from the post office after 17 years of service, and we would come to the States. We had no thought of starting another nudist club, I assure you.
Okay.
But when we got down to California and visited all the different clubs there, traveling with our trailer, we found that they were all beset with inspectors who checked every week or so to see that there were no trailers there in any of the clubs on weekdays. Saturday and Sunday, they could bring their trailers out, but they had to go home on the weekend and after it was over and leave the trailers in storage if they would, but they couldn't have them in
Not
living.
on the park grounds.
Yeah. Well, the owner of Olive Dell, he finally told me, he says, I sold an acre of my land to one of my members when I needed some money. And he says, I'll let you park on his acre of land. And when the inspectors come, I'll be able to tell them that it isn't my land, that I have no control over you sitting there. You're acting as a guardian for that man's land. And so that's how I came to settle at Olive Dell in 1958. And through 59, 60, 61, 62, we were there each winter. In the summer we traveled. In fact, we traveled back up to Sunny Trails for 2 summers, and if you've ever heard of the famous nude open house at Sunny Trails in 1958, I initiated that after it having been a success at Sunny Rest. Sunny Rest in Pennsylvania had nude open house each year and didn't have any problems with the authorities. And so with that, I persuaded the board of Sunny Trails that maybe we should try it. And somewhere along the line, I should have been telling you that publicity, of course, was my claim to fame. I had more stories about Sunny Trails, for instance, in the years that I was the managing director. I had so many stories about it that one time the editor of the Province is said to have announced that if there was one more story from that nudist club, he didn't finish the sentence. And within a month, he had another story that he couldn't resist publishing, because the secret of good PR is to write a story that the editor will jump at, you see. And actually now 2 or 3 stories came out of the Northwest because we nudists in Canada were very, very hush-hush, especially the Willamettans insisted that I would not identify them even by name, meaning by name the club.
Okay.
Let alone talking about John and Jane. I couldn't talk about the Willamettan Club. But reluctantly they agreed, after we had come back from a convention down here, that it would be all right to say that 27 lower mainland nudists, Canadian nudists, had attended the convention. And I'm not sure whether that was I'm speaking now to you as Willamettans, the Willamettans' first convention, which was over at Philomath, or the first story I ever got may have been out of Restful Haven. But I'll tell you both of them so as you get an idea the sort of stories that anybody can use to help their own club. I remember 2 or 3 stories that I was able to get published in Canada from Northwest conventions. And curiously, they went right across Canada in the Canadian and United Press and were picked up in New York and sent back across in the channels here. So one of the first pieces of publicity about the Willamettans in the Eugene paper was the convention that you had at Philomath. And I don't recall that there was anything outstanding about it. It was just a straightforward story. My brother was a garage mechanic in Eugene, and he just about died because Connett is a rare name. And his name was Connett, and people were saying, "Oh, I read about you in the paper." He says, "That's my brother up in Canada." But that was the point, that if I could write a story that would be interesting enough to pick up across the country, it would come back and be picked up in your local paper here, even if you didn't want publicity.
Yeah.
Anyway, we had another story about the convention at Restful Haven. It was so hot that people had to go and put clothes on. They were getting burned, badly burned. And the newspaper editors just thought that was something.
I imagine they thought that was hilarious.
And that got us good coverage up in Canada too. And then one of the most original that I'll take credit for was at Spokane, or not Spokane. We had publicity there, but Squaw Mountain had several old codgers who had obtained deputy sheriff's stars and were authorized to, run trespassers off and so forth. So some of the photographers, Ed and June Lang, who are now Elysium, and at that time were working for Mervyn Mounce's magazines, they wanted to pose these people with their stars. And first of all, it was all right. They were very attractive on their hat. But somebody got the idea of fastening it on their bare chest with Scotch tape. Well, that was a story no editor could resist. The idea that these nudists had deputy sheriffs among the members who, because they were in the nude, had to show their stars on their chest with Scotch tape holding them on.
That's good.
So anyway, that's sort of the thing that I used to use in publicity. And of course, before there was ever television, we had call-in shows on radio. And New Westminster, for instance, had the Man on the Street broadcast, where every morning the reporter went down to see the bus off. And he would interview on the microphone people that were going, ask them where they were going, what they were doing, who they were, and so forth. And there was when we started the Sunny Trails Club, the question of the week was, should we let these nudists have, start a club there? A lot of people were demanding that the council pass a law about nudism. And so for the first 2 or 3 days, there was a lot of anti-nudist expression. And then along about Wednesday, it just seemed like the tide turned. And meanwhile, I'd been on the radio a couple of times. And by the end of the week, general consensus was, if they're behind closed doors and in their behind their wooded area that nobody could see into, it's not nobody's business. And So
That was a very positive breakthrough for you. I imagine there
you,
were a lot of tense moments.
you bet, you bet. I used the argument because they had said that they didn't, it was right by a high school, and they thought the kids on their way home from school would get off into the nudist club and go peeking. And I said, well, that is just about as reasonable as saying that they'll climb up on a ladder and peek into somebody's bathroom window. And I said, I don't think our young people do that sort of thing. And I said, I don't think they'll come and bother us where we are. But meanwhile, I issued an invitation to the council to come and see us without any prior arrangement, to drop in any time, any day of the week, any hour of the day, and judge us by what they would find there. And boy, that just took, that did the trick in the papers. There was no question about that at all. The council, they couldn't get to first base with any proposed legislation.
That's great.
And meanwhile, I had told them that there was any amount of cases in the states over the past years where it had been well established that nudism was not a threat to morals or the integrity of an area, that people didn't suffer from having nudists next door or anything like that. And I took them all the literature that was available from the ASA at that time, and we had no trouble at all getting started at Sunny Trails. And then every year, when we celebrated our annual, oh yeah, we started open houses at Sunny Trails. I mean, none of the clubs here had ever done such a thing. And how I did it was to have an open house on Saturday night when we asked our members to wear their clothes after 6 o'clock. Then and then only did we let the public in. And they were brought in and they were guided everywhere that they went. They were shown a tour of the whole grounds. And we had a table covered with a big sheet of plate glass. And under it were all photos and newspaper clippings of what had been happening. And so every year we had that as an annual celebration.
When was your first open house? What year, do you recall?
53.
53.
Yeah. I took the first group of nudists down to see the property on the Sunday of Labor Day weekend, 1952. And so Sunny Trails officially dates from September the 1st, 1952. And then every year thereafter, so the following year, not on Labor Day weekend, but when it was convenient for the CSA to give us our charter, we got our charter on the middle weekend of July in 1953, and hence then from then on, why we celebrated Charter Weekend on the middle weekend in July, and that was when we had the open house. That way, you get the best weather. You didn't wait till the end of the year and then they'd forget about it through the winter, but instead we had it right through the summer. I bet you can think of a couple of other questions.
Well, okay, your name has come up many, many times in the introduction of getting clubs launched all across Canada. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, it isn't quite as all across Canada as we make it sound, but I was the National Secretary of the Canadian Sunbathing Association, which I personally can take credit for having brought into existence. I mean, I wrote for a year the articles in the Canadian Sunbathing for Health magazine, which crystallized nudist thinking in Canada so that people stopped being just readers and lookers and decided to write in and see about starting a club in their area. And Ilsley Boone, Uncle Danny Boone, had for years in Sunshine and Health used that system of numbered groups. that anybody who, after an exchange of letters, seemed to have anything on the ball at all towards being potential group leaders were given the responsibility of having letters sent to them through the magazine and then to them all anonymously without any exchange of information, so that somebody in Sarnia, Ontario, for instance, with a possibility of starting a club, would get all the letters from Sarnia and would call them up and make their acquaintance and go through a process of interview them, and eventually, by that method, in fact, within 1 year, we had 15 nuclear groups across Canada. So to that extent, I brought that all into being by copying Uncle Danny's methods, you see. Um, Oftentimes they would write to me if they had problems in the club. I, voice of authority from afar, could sometimes settle things and keep them going. And the only real claim I have towards any other club across Canada is the Sunny Chinooks in Alberta. When I retired from the post office and started to travel with the trailer up in the summertime to Canada and south of the States in the winter, why, one of the clubs that I visited was the Calgary Club. And they had just literally hung themselves with rules. They were so near death, just total stagnation. But imagine, for instance, they had a rule that a prospective member that wrote to the club could only be interviewed by the entire board. Well, the simple problem there was that you'd never get all the board together to interview a prospective member.
Understand.
So anyway, they had a lot of other rules too. And as an honored guest, they invited me to a business meeting, and halfway through the meeting they asked me if I would care to tell them, express an opinion on anything they were doing. And I told them that unless they were prepared to feel bad about me, they had better just continue their meeting. And they said, no, you tell us exactly what you see here that might possibly need to be changed or anything. So after I got through telling them, point, the things I could see that were just unacceptable and were hampering their progress, they gave me authority. I was willing to stay there a month because I had relatives now in Calgary anyway. They gave me a 1 month authority total to run the club. Change it in any way I advised.
King for a month.
1 month. Well, my goodness. I immediately got newspaper publicity for them and immediately initiated an advertising campaign, a little personal ad that had been very successful with us over the years at Sunny Trails. Used to say, sunbathe for health and relaxation. Information free. Illustrated nudist booklet, $1. And the address. That illustrated nudist booklet was Mervyn Mounts' nudist primer, and it cost at that time 15 cents a copy. And we sold it for $1, paid all our advertising costs. Anyway, and I immediately got them started with a newspaper, which still has the name that I've chose for it, Poplar Leaves. So, to that extent, I can take a little credit for Sunny Chinooks, and I picked the man that for years was the president there and subsequently ended being the owner of the property that they went on. Big tall fellow with a cowboy hat. Rod Flack.
Okay.
Rod Flack. He was just a medical student at the time, But among all those people, I could see that he had the initiative and the spark and the feeling that would probably carry that club to success. And so I recommended that they try him for president. And after we left, why, they just went on. They got land and continued to do all the things that I had recommended. And in fact, in later years, they actually got more publicity for the Sunday Chinooks Club than any other club in the whole of Canada.
That's great. That's wonderful. Uh, in your many years in nudism, what are the major changes do you think that you've seen in nudism in your years of activity?
I think that perhaps the most important thing I see now, and I'm even going to take some credit for this. You notice I'm not modest. I can't.
You can't be if you're a leader, a mover and a shaker.
All right. I have always been in favor of openness about nudism, use of full names. And I never, ever have concealed my name. In fact, when I started to work in the post office, now this is a government position, and I hadn't been there more than a month before I started receiving mail back from this Canadian Sunbathing for Health magazine, and what was I going to do about it, because it was addressed to Ray Connett, and some of it was addressed to Sunny Trails, the title of the page I was writing. So from there on, I have always advocated full use of names. And if there are people who want to go by one name only, or a name and initial, or, as was common here in the Northwest, they have cute nicknames. I can remember fraternities who called me when there was electric bill and sewer bill.
That's unusual.
Well, they were specialists. They were
Okay.
specialists in their trades, and nobody used their last name in those days in any of the Northwest clubs. Well, anyway, I started. We haven't talked about Glen Eden yet.
No, we haven't, and we know
But
that's
anyhow,
the biggie.
I had the registration form at Sunny Trails, and it gave you a choice. It said, how may your name be used? A, for any purpose. B, in club newsletter and notice boards only. C, only first name. And once you signed that and marked your thing, why, we carefully followed that. And that way, when there's a need for people to be interviewed by radio visitors and so forth, I knew who I could get who were willing to use their full names, because I didn't want any of this nonsense in an interview. Well, halfway through the interview, the man happens to ask them their name or something, and they say, oh, well, we don't give that, see?
Hmm. I
And there
understand.
are clubs that tell people when they come for their first visit, we don't use last names here. Saul Stern likes to tell the story that he's a lawyer. He was a lawyer all life. And he joined Lupin's way back in about 52. Anyhow, he started passing his card around. And they called him into the office. We don't do that here. He says, well, I have always given my name to anybody that I'm talking to, and he says, I'm going to keep on doing so. But when I started Glen Eden, again, we had these forms that gave people a choice. But within 3 or 4 years, they just couldn't see the point of even bothering about that question on the form, and they no longer do it. But we have last names complete. Now, the reason I take a little credit for the use of last names is that as a trustee and as PR chairman for a couple of terms in the ASA, I stood up conventions and pleaded with with the nudist public to come out of the closet. We will never make progress until we are proud of what we are doing. If we're ashamed of what we're doing and hide it from our best friends, then how is the club and how is nudism as a whole ever going to grow?
So that opening up is what you see as the major positive uh, thing in nudism that has helped its well, we've just sudden resurgence or surge of popularity and
Well, I
such.
wish I could take credit for that, but much of that relates to Jim Hadley and things that he made possible. But as far as finally making the grade at a convention one time, okay, they voted that all names in the bulletin would be in full. People who wrote for Club News and so forth, they had to use full names. Now the point is, if you want to be John Jones instead of John Jackson, nobody's going to know or care. But you mustn't give a semblance of, oh, we're ashamed of what we're doing, or we're afraid to let it be known. That spirit cannot help us move forward.
I agree wholeheartedly. The any secrecy just fuels suspicion
Right.
in the minds of folks that don't know what's going on. Uh, so that is basically the major change you've seen in nudism over the years. But now we have not touched on Glen Eden, which I know is a feather in your cap. Can you tell us the story of Glen Eden?
Well, I had no thought when I went to the States of starting another club. But it wasn't very long before living at Olive Dell in the winter months. Dear lady Alicia Lloyd, who for years was proud of the title Nudist Lady Number 4, and she was the first woman elected to the Nudist Hall of Fame.
Yes, I know.
Anyway, she told Bill Kiesel that he was missing a bet if he didn't get Ray Connett to help him with his office work and promotion and so forth. So he approached me and asked if I could do anything for him and whether we wanted to make any arrangement. And so I told him that if he wanted me to help promote Olive Dell, and it was a garbage dump at the end of the road. It was the worst looking specimen of a nudist camp that you'd ever imagine. I've seen worse. There's one in Kansas that had chickens jump up and walk around on the dining table. But
Wouldn't
anyway,
be the same one that had goats in the yard, would it?
goats?
Yeah.
Oh, I should imagine so.
Yeah. I think I know of that one.
Anyway, Bill, I drew up a contract. I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't go to a lawyer except to approve the final words of this contract. But I drew up a contract with Bill Kiesel to bring in, to spend my own money advertising for members for Olive Dell. And I took over his entire office, and first thing I found was that a lot of the old timers were sitting there riding on his shoulders. They weren't even paying their electric bills. So I got that all tightened up, and they hate me, the damn Canadians that had come in there, and we stopped drinking parties and a few things. Actually, Olive Dell had a very bad odor down. They weren't in the ASA, and I told him that I would not work with him unless his club was in the ASA. And he says, well, then you get it in the ASA. When I went to get it in the ASA, why, his members told him that, well, that's a much longer story. So anyway, I tripled Bill Kiesel's membership in the 2.5 years that I was there. And I brought in enough money to give him a lovely cement pool instead of a rubber pool, flush toilets instead of biffies, and he never kept his word for the final part of our contract, which was to give me full management of Olive Dell after the first 2 years. So some of the members came to Mildred and I and said, why don't you start a club of your own and show what you actually can do instead of just bringing members in for Bill? We did this on commission, incidentally, with Bill. We got 50% of everything that we brought in. But if a member came that had just simply read about Olive Dell in the magazine, that was Bill's money. And yet I did all the work of handling it without any compensation at all. But from then on, when we started bringing money in, half of what we took in was ours. And it took me a little over a year just to get back the money that I had been putting into advertising. But then it started to pay off.
Mm-hmm.
So I really wasn't interested in starting another club. Meanwhile, we had built that red house that's still at Olive Dell across the front gate. We had built that as our design for a residence and an office that people would have to drive past the office and stop and sign in as they went through. This was unheard of in any of the clubs. And so reluctantly, with my wife's persuasion, I said, okay, this Cliff Kennedy was the real ringleader in this, and Cliff Kennedy is honored at Glen Eden now with Kennedy Grove. Anyway, he said, if you will pay my gas and oil, I will do all of the running around visiting real estate offices and looking at land signs and so forth. And he took me to about 15 locations. He took me to what had been a camp for a school. And it had a stainless steel kitchen and all log buildings and 3 dormitories for sleeping and several cottages for the staff. But the trees just leaned that way. And it was winter when we were going looking for this land. So I kept telling him no. But when he found Glen Eden, we eventually ended up making a deal with the people there were 3 brothers that owned the land. And they couldn't sell it because 70 acres of it was in olive tree land, which is quite valuable. And 90 acres of it was a wash, rocky wash, and a mountain. These brothers would say no to anybody that came to see them. They would only sell the whole quarter section. So Cliff Kennedy made up a deal. He says, look, he says, we can take the land that nobody else wants, and then you'll be able to sell that good land with the olive trees on it. Within 2 or 3 years, you'll get, well, anyhow, to make a long story short, we got that land for $300 an acre.
Okay.
And no money down. The reason we got such a deal was that we were almost then on the verge of signing a 20-year lease on land for $100 a quarter a month. And so we told these brothers that we had to have the equivalent of that deal in order to be able to afford to buy the land that they had. And in the end,
They could see that it was a good deal.
Well, it was the only way that they could get rid of the land uh, that nobody wanted, and that way they'd be able to sell the good land. So I became the Mildred, and I paid the land payments for the first 3 years while it was trickling through court. It had to go through court because one of the brothers was in a California asylum, and California wanted to be sure that the amount of money being paid for the property, 1/3 of which would accrue to them for the upkeep of this brother, was adequate. So a judge had to be satisfied, and it went into court. It took that long. And I had told the members all along that it would be a member-owned club, and that was unheard of. In California, there was no such thing as a member-owned club, except the Sequoians up in the Bay Area. But the people down south, I was a communist.
Oh dear.
That's the only answer. I was a communist to come up with such an idea as that. And so I got a lot of brand new people. I didn't steal members from other clubs. I got them out of the newspaper. In fact, I like to brag that I didn't take anybody in St. Shrells Club. I didn't steal anybody from the Willamettans. I had been the secretary, and you know how many clubs get started by some of the people moving to start a club of their own, and they do it by taking half of that club.
Right, that is true. It's happened many times.
Well, I wouldn't do that as a matter of conscience, but I also had another reason. I didn't want to have to be explaining to people all the time, persuading them to let me do what I wanted to do as managing director, because I had such advanced ideas as far as PR and so on. So I got brand new people that took my word for everything.
That's terrific. You have had an illustrious career.
Is that well? Not really, except that as the PR chairman for the ASA, when I was traveling, I used to give a lot of advice to him because it would listen. And I often volunteered to go into the television or radio stations or the newspapers and get stories for that local club that they weren't able to get for themselves. I could get on the telephone, and just because I was Ray Connett, ASA, or they wouldn't know what that meant, but PR chairman for the American Sunbathing Association, and I'd start speaking for the local club and get stories in that they themselves didn't have the will or the ability to produce. I can remember something that happened right on these grounds. Here at the Willamettans, way back when there was still a clubhouse, an old house down here, and the board were having a meeting, and one of the members asked me to speak to them about publicity. And I just sat down and drafted 2 or 3 news releases that they might possibly consider taking into the local paper. And they did. Just an example of how a visitor that has a little bit of reputation or authority or even speaks well, they'll pay attention when they wouldn't do it themselves. And from there, it's possible that a lot of the PR progress in this club might go back to that meeting when they were sure they didn't want anything like a press release, but Ray Connett suggested it, wrote it out for them, and they did it.
Well, Ray, I'd like to thank you very much for the time you've given us, and hopefully this footage will be of use to a lot of people who listen to it and enjoy listening to you tell about the history of nudism. And if it's talking about you, it's talking about the history of nudism.
Thank you very much.